Okay, so we've gone through the cardiac cycle where we figured out, or we kind of went through what parts and pieces there were to the heart. Now let's actually look at the figures and look at the model and the histology. So this should look familiar from AP1 when we went through the tissues and you had to learn the different types of muscular tissue. This is the same thing. It's cardiac muscle tissue. You can see the nuclei. You can see the intercalated discs. Okay, you can actually see one right there. You can see another one right here, where it's actually cutting across that tissue with those special cell-to-cell connections, because your heart has to beat in perfect sequence. If your heart doesn't beat in perfect sequence, then you die. Remember, we talked about those valves? Those valves only work if the sequence is followed. If the sequence isn't followed, they just seal up and nothing flows anywhere. So having intercalated discs, which are these special cell-to-cell connections that allow the cells to communicate with each other, is actually really important. Okay, so that's the one slide that I want you to know, histology slide that I want you to know. Where does the slide come from? What organ does the slide come from? The heart. What system does this slide belong to? Cardiovascular. Excuse me. What is this a slide of? Cardiac muscle. Identify. A, identify B. You should be able to do that. Why are you having such a hard time with that? Maybe if I move over here. Okay. I'm going to pause for just a sec. All right, so your heart is covered in membranous tissue. This is not new information. You've known this since AP1, chapter 1. We literally talked about the fact that you've got membranes on top of your organs because your heart beats, and every time it beats, it rubs. Now imagine doing this for 5 hours nonstop. Your hands would eventually get rubbed raw, especially the outside of your hand. The inside might be able to take it a little better, but still the outside would rub itself raw. We talked about putting a pair of latex gloves on, shoving your hands in Vaseline, and then doing this. Not only do you have lubricant between the layers, but you've got that protective coating of the gloves. That's what the membranes are. Your heart continuously moves. It moves every single second of every single day. It never stops because when it does, you die. So we've got this kind of red lining on our heart. This is the visceral pericardium. Peri means around, cardio means heart. So visceral always means internal. You'll hear the term visceral organs. Those are your internal organs. The only non-visceral organ that we have is our skin. So the visceral pericardium is literally like shrink wrap on top of your heart. Then you've got the chamber that your heart sits in being covered by another membrane. It's in blue right here. This is the parietal pericardium. Parietal pericardium basically covers the chamber that your heart sits in. And then you've got this cavity, the space between this red and this blue, that space right there. This is actually filled with pericardial fluid. Pericardial fluid is going to be the lubricant that we have between the layers, that Vaseline for my gloves. Outside of that, you've got this other layer right here in white, okay? This is going to be the fibrous pericardium. Parietal and visceral pericardium can also be called the serous pericardium, but I want you to know these two terms and this term. But either way, this is literally the sac that covers your heart and protects it. Now, if I were to take a chunk out of the heart and kind of blow it up, these are going to be the layers that you would see. Internally, you've got the endocardium, okay? You've got the endocardium right here. What is that? Hang on. Nope, still not all that much better. The endocardium is the inner layer of your heart. This is the myocardium. Myo, that prefix means muscle, okay? So this is the cardiac muscle. This is the majority of what your heart is made out of, because if you think about it, what's the function of the heart? To pump the blood. What's the only tissue in your body that moves? The muscle. Externally here, you've got the epicardium, also known as the visceral pericardium. So remember that layer that surrounds the outside of the heart, like shrink wrap? That's what this is. You've got some adipose there, you've got some loose connective tissue, and a simple squamous layer. Why? Or simple squamous epithelium layer. Why? Because epithelium always covers a surface. Internally, you've got kind of this slick looking layer that is there to be protective, okay? That's what that endocardium is. The trabeculae carnae are actually these raised ridges in your ventricles that you are going to see in the figures. So this is your heart from the front, okay? Something to keep in mind with your heart. I think a lot of people think your heart sits completely up and down. It doesn't. It actually faces this way. So when you see a heart model and it looks like it's leaning, it's not just straight up and down like this, it's actually at an angle. There's a reason that it's at an angle like that. It's at an angle like that because that's how it actually sits in your chest. Okay, so the heart itself, we just drew this. You've got the right atrium, the left atrium. This big, huge portion at the bottom is where the ventricles are. So you have the right ventricle, you have the left ventricle. Now remember something when it comes to your heart and the jobs of each of these chambers. Remember that the bottom chambers are the power chambers that actually have to push the blood to another location. That automatically means that they are going to be big and muscular and thick. So them taking up the majority of the heart totally makes sense. So a sulcus, coronary sulcus. Sulcus is like a groove, okay? It's like this indention in the heart. And you actually do have this coronary sulcus that is kind of the groove where these arteries and veins are going to sit on the surface of your heart. So you've got the right coronary artery. Remember, if this is sitting in my chest, this is going to be right, this is going to be left, okay? So I've got the right coronary artery. We talked about those coronary arteries coming out and supplying the heart with blood, with the oxygenated blood. We also have these big vessels that are draining into my right atrium. This is my superior vena cava. This is my inferior vena cava, okay? On the other side, we have the apex of the heart. This is that kind of pointed end. If you look at the model, this pointed end is going to be the apex. So we have the apex of the heart, the left ventricle. See how this goes right down the center? If you look at the model, it would be right here. Here are my two ventricles. Okay, here are my two ventricles. See how it's right down the center of the two ventricles? This is going to be the interventricular, in between ventricular, the two ventricles. So it's the interventricular artery. And where is it? It's on the front. So anterior interventricular artery. This sits inside of another sulcus. Remember, the sulcus just means there's kind of a groove in there. So it sits inside this groove that's dead center in the middle of your heart. All right. The great cardiac vein. It is the biggest vein in the front of the heart, so that's what they call it. Again, it sits inside of that sulcus, that anterior interventricular sulcus. And like I said, you've got your left atrium. Now let's talk about what's up here. So we mentioned the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava, right? This is the aorta. This is the aortic arch. You can see it makes an arch. Not really all that surprising. When we talked about the right ventricle pumping the blood out, we said that it went into the pulmonary trunk, right? This is the pulmonary trunk, and it splits into the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery. So from under here, it actually does split into these two arteries, going away from the heart toward the lungs. Pulmonary means lungs, right? Up here, the veins, that superior vena cava basically has three major inlets who are draining into them. You've got the right jugular coming from the head, the right subclavian, your clavicle, right? Correct? So you've got that coming from your arm, this coming from your head. The left side is a little bit different in the fact that you've got, actually, it isn't. Ugh. The right brachiocephalic is where these merge. The left internal jugular, the left subclavian, left brachiocephalic, these are the two major trunks that are going to merge together to make it into my superior vena cava. Everything else drains into these major highways to get into my major superior vena cava. Yeah. Now, don't flip out. See everything in yellow? We just went through all of that. So these are the same names, nothing has changed. The only ones that have changed are the ones at the top. I went through the veins that were up here. Now we're going to go through the arteries. So we have the aortic arch, right? This splits as well. This is the one that has three major outlets. On the right side, you have the brachiocephalic trunk that splits into the right common carotid and the right subclavian arteries. However, on the left, there is no trunk here. It literally just splits into the left common carotid and the left subclavian arteries. And you'll see that better from the back view, okay? Wrong computer. So here's that back view. Here's the brachiocephalic trunk. Here's that common carotid. Here's the subclavian, okay? And these are the left, this goes right. Now, the thing about the brachiocephalic trunk is it does split into a common carotid and a subclavian as it keeps going off of this, but the origin is actually just this big trunk. Now, I want you to notice that most of this is labeled in yellow, right? Correct? Okay. The reason that I'm saying that is because you've already seen all of this. It's just like saying, nah, please don't fall. Okay,